Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 6 wide receiver rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses thus far this season, on average, have been giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers to give us some perspective as to who has the most advantageous or perhaps the most disadvantageous matchup going into the week. After we cover matchups, we'll talk about my top 36 wide receiver rankings, as I'll share my perspective and opinions and the statistics that justify the reasoning as to how I think the wide receiver position is going to stack up when all is said and done by the end of Week 6. Before we begin today's video, we have to remind you there are 4 teams on bye week. Do not forget the Atlanta Falcons, the New Orleans Saints, the New York Jets, and of course, the San Francisco 49ers are all on bye. And though all of them have prospects that could potentially be started in the top 36, unfortunately, we will not have them to help our cause this week in our Week 6 contest. So do not forget about that. Of course, that'll give opportunities for other wide receivers that typically aren't on this list to be mentioned today, but just wanted to kind of remind you guys, do not forget about that. Again, another thing you guys shouldn't forget about is subscribing to the channel. We're making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2021 season. So if you want more content in the way of rankings, live streams on Sunday mornings, whether it is strength of schedules, hidden gems, trade targets, all of that kind of stuff. If you want another source of fantasy football content to help you win a 2021 fantasy football championship, subscribe here today. Thank you very much for the support, all of you, for liking, your viewership, commenting down below. Cannot thank you guys enough. Outside of that, another reminder, Underdog Fantasy is another way to play fantasy football. Every Thursday night, they have a contest in which you can go ahead, draft the team against 2 other contestants, and then compete against the entire world in order to determine who has the best overall squad on that given week. And of course, win some prizes. So for those of you who are interested, if you guys haven't yet already checked them out, go down to the description of the video, click the link, and use promo code Andrew. With your first deposit of $10 or more, you'll be given an additional $10 in bonus cash, in which you can use for tomorrow's contests, whether it is Pick'ems, the Rumble, Resurrection, Best Ball Leagues, for those of you who are trying to draft a full team from week 6 through 17 and see if you got what it takes to win it all. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into Week 6 and the wide receiver position. But again, we're going to begin with matchups. All right, just wanted to go ahead and present once again the statistics that every single team thus far this season in the National Football League have given up to opposing wide receivers. As we can see, on an average basis, in terms of fantasy points per game given to opposing wide receivers, the Tennessee Titans are at the top of the list in terms of giving up the most points, 39.96 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, followed by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Pittsburgh Steelers, Washington Football Team, and of course, Miami Dolphins. These are teams that have struggled heavily in the secondary, and though many of these teams have been in the past great secondaries, this season have been abused week in and week out, and that's something that we want to potentially take advantage of, because if in fact wide receivers are going to succeed because their secondaries are either not playing up to their standard or of course dealing with injuries, we have to go ahead and identify that in order to give ourselves more of an advantage on a given week. Now on the other end of the spectrum, we have the Buffalo Bills, the New York Jets, Los Angeles Chargers, Las Vegas Raiders, and Carolina Panthers among the teams in terms of giving up the fewest points to opposing wide receivers. Of course, we saw last week the Buffalo Bills on Sunday Night Football completely shut down the entire offense of Patrick Mahomes. Tyreek Hill wasn't able to get much. I mean, McCole Hardman was the leading receiver with 9 receptions in that contest. In terms of overall productivity, sure, they got Travis Kelce involved, but that's yes, he's kind of like a wide receiver in that offense, but he's a tight end. In terms of the wide receiver position, they really locked it down, and they haven't really given up much all season long. Now, of course, we talk about the Los Angeles Chargers, another team that's, as of thus far this season, only given up 4 touchdowns to opposing wide receivers, but the greatest performances that we've seen against them aren't even from upper elite receivers. It's often guys that are the number 2 or 3 receiver on that offense. So now that we've kind of given you guys some perspective as to what exactly has happened thus far this season, like, you know, the Indianapolis Colts giving up 10 touchdowns to opposing wide receivers. That's a number that we have to keep an eye on, right? Another statistic in terms of who's given up the fewest stats. Yes, fantasy points might be there, but look at the Philadelphia Eagles. They've given up the fewest receptions. They've had the fewest targets amongst, you know, the wide receiver position against them. These are things to kind of take into account. Keep an eye on. Las Vegas Raiders have only given up 1 touchdown to opposing wide receivers this season. That is an interesting number and something that could be into effect this week in terms of their matchup. Just want to go ahead, present these to you guys, give you guys some extra, you know, overall statistics to keep in mind. I will be referring back to these as I go throughout the video. And speaking of that video, we are going to proceed and begin talking about my top 36 wide receiver rankings. Do not forget, like it says on screen, rankings are always subject to change. Again, we are recording this on a Wednesday, And if in fact we get to a Friday and an injury from a player is to either designate them as out or perhaps limited in this upcoming weekend's game, this is all going to change potentially. I mean, I changed my mind a lot. And by the time we get to Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, I'll have updated rankings there for those of you who are interested. So swing on by. Thank you. All right, let's begin by talking about the wide receiver position. And our number one on the week, it is Davante Adams. It shouldn't be a surprise. We talked about him as, you know, I want to have him as my number one every week because I know he has the potential to be the number one every single week as long as he is with Aaron Rodgers. And Aaron Rodgers came through this last week and delivered a lot of, seeds to him. Gave him 16 total targets, 11 receptions, 206 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown, and 32.1 fantasy points. In a full PPR, I mean, he absolutely took over. But in a half PPR, we'll take that any day of the week, especially when we're competing with that Monday night game where everyone's dropping 30. I'm glad, the studs like Davante Adams are actually beginning to show up. Either way, this upcoming week, they play against the Chicago Bears, a division rival and a team that Davante Adams himself is very comfortable playing against. As a guy that is currently leading the National Football League in total targets, he's of course going to be given a lot of opportunity, and when he is going to be given that opportunity, he will deliver. In the last 3 games that he's played against the Chicago Bears, he has had 6+ receptions in every single one of those contests, and at least 1 touchdown in each of those contests. Again, that's the last 3 games against the Chicago Bears. Specifically, the fantasy points in which he produced against them: 15.1, 13.6, 19.8 in a half PPR scoring format. Of course, we're expecting more, especially with Marquez Valdes-Scantling on the injured reserve, Robert Tonyan not being a big enough factor in this offense. We think, of course, Davante Adams should be great and once again maintain the number 1 spot. Tyreek Hill is our number 2 overall wide receiver. So Tyreek Hill is currently dealing with a little bit of a knee injury. We knew that he was kind of hit with a questionable tag after that Sunday Night Football game against the Buffalo Bills, in which he didn't find much success, but at least was able to get himself 7 catches for 63 yards, 11.3 half PPR fantasy points, after coming off an incredible week of 3 touchdowns and over 100 yards against the Philadelphia Eagles secondary. Now the question remains, what are we going to see from him this week? Because again, you play against the Washington football team, one of, if not the easiest matchup at the wide receiver position, considering, of course, they're giving up the 4th most points, and the statistics that are on screen don't even include the upside that Cordero Patterson had against them, because I see Cordero Patterson as more of a overall running back because that's basically where he's been lining up for the majority of the season. So with that said, Washington has given up a lot of touchdowns. They've given up a lot of points in general. I mean, if we go back to week 1, of course, Keenan Allen had a great game, but Mike Williams, 8 catches, 82 yards, and a touchdown. I mean, we saw just this last week, Jameis Winston had the best game of his season in terms of total passing yards, and of course was getting everyone involved in the passing game. Deontay Harris had himself a 1 catch, 72 yards, and a touchdown. Marquez Callaway had the best game of his season, 85 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. We even saw guys earlier in the season, Emmanuel Sanders, 2 receiving touchdowns against the Washington football team. There's a lot of potential here. As long as Tyreek Hill is lacing up, he's in my lineup and ready to go. DeAndre Hopkins is our number 3. I had a feeling that he was going to have a great bounce-back game this last week, and I'm glad he did, mainly because the San Francisco 49ers matchup for him has always treated him well. But now we go into week 6, and what are we going to potentially see out of a DeAndre Hopkins-esque kind of wide receiver? I believe that I have enough confidence to once again roll him out there as a upper-tier wide receiver. Now, again, like I talk about, these are all guys you're starting regardless. You don't bench DeAndre Hopkins regardless of what happens, regardless of even if he's dealing with an injury. He's coming off a week in which he had 86 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown, 17.7 fantasy points, 9 targets. Okay, those are good numbers, but not the greatest. And hopefully that's going to continue to rise as he plays against the Cleveland Browns this week. I've talked about it. The Cleveland Browns cannot stop number 1 wide receivers. And DeAndre Hopkins is the number 1, without a doubt in my mind, for that Arizona Cardinals offense. And let's see what number 1 wide receivers have done to that secondary. Tyreek Hill week 1, 11 catches, 197 and a touchdown. Brandin Cooks, 9 catches, 78 and a touchdown. Justin Jefferson, 6 catches, 84 and a touchdown. And just this last week, Mike Williams torched that defense. 8 catches, 165, and 2 touchdowns. There's a lot of potential for DeAndre Hopkins to succeed this week, and that's exactly what I anticipate, and that's why we're firing him up once again. We move on to Stefon Diggs, our number 4. Though Stefon Diggs has been extremely underwhelming in fantasy football right now, I think this is a great time to go out and buy Stefon Diggs. If you can potentially trade for him, coming off another week in which he was underutilized, 5 targets, 2 receptions, 69 total yards, 7.9 half PPR fantasy points, if you can go ahead and go out and buy him, I think that's a great idea. He's associated with perhaps the best team in football right now, and an offense that really can kind of pick you apart from anywhere on the field, whether it is at the tight end position, the running back position, whether the quarterback, Josh Allen, is torching you with his legs. There's a lot of receivers getting involved in this offense, and though we haven't seen the major games from Stefon Diggs, of course we saw a 100-yard week in week 4, I think it's all to come. The opportunity is there, and this is one of those games this last week that, sure, he was bottled up and they didn't need to utilize him. It was a rain game, didn't really have to throw the ball much in that contest as well. Very seldom do we ever see Stefon Diggs with less than 8 total targets. I mean, since being with the Buffalo Bills, this isn't, uncommon thing, and to be honest, shouldn't happen again. I think, in my opinion, this is a great time to buy him. I think the game against the Tennessee Titans is perfect. They're literally the best matchup at the wide receiver position. They've given up the most points to opposing wide receivers. If I have to go ahead and read it, Lockett, 8 catches, 178 and a touchdown. Corey Davis, 4 catches, 111 and a touchdown. DeAndre Hopkins, week 1, he had 2 receiving touchdowns. So did Christian Kirk. A lot of receivers have dominated this secondary. And though the Jacksonville Jaguars, 2 studs, weren't able to do anything, we still saw Tavon Austin tear them apart. And if Tavon Austin's doing work to your secondary, then imagine what a Stefon Diggs can do. Last season when they played against Tennessee, he had 16 targets, 10 catches, 106 yards. I think Stefon Diggs is ready to get back on track this week. We move on to Cooper Kupp as our number 5. Though Cooper Kupp was a little bit of the secondary role in that offense, specifically in the passing game, considering Robert Woods had his breakout game of the season, I still believe Cooper Kupp is the number 1 in that offense, considering through weeks 1 through 5, he has had 10 plus targets in every single game. This last week, 7 catches, 92 yards. Of course, if he accompanies that performance with a touchdown, he's a 20-point guy. He's getting himself into this upper echelon. And that's why I leave him in this conversation, because they take on the New York Giants. And while everyone will be worried about Robert Woods on the outside and James Bradberry is going to be, of course, focusing over there, Cooper Kupp's going to be dicing them up across the middle of the field, in which he's done all season long to every single defense that they've played against. And I think that's going to happen once again this week. Of course, we've seen other wide receivers dominate against the secondary, but it's just a matter of opportunity and what exactly we've seen from Cooper Kupp this season. It's just skill, dominating against anything that's been put up against him. As long as Matthew Stafford is, of course, funnel targeting in the direction of Cooper Kupp, getting other pieces like a Tyler Higbee and a Robert Woods more involved continues to alleviate the pressure off of Cooper Kupp, and perhaps defensive coordinators aren't paying as much of attention to him. If that's the case, Cooper Kupp's having himself another big week here. Justin Jefferson and the thumbnail is our number 6. I love Justin Jefferson in any sort of capacity. Doesn't matter who they're playing against. Thus far this season, Justin Jefferson in every single game has had at least 70 receiving yards or a receiving touchdown in his games. Unfortunately, this last week wasn't able to get a receiving touchdown, but was able to get himself 124 receiving yards against the Detroit Lions secondary that we all knew was bad. Now, the conversation is whether or not the Carolina Panthers secondary is something to worry about. Maybe if, in fact, Stephon Gilmore was lacing up and ready to play, we'd be a little bit concerned, but I'm not too concerned about the current matchup going against Carolina this week. I know Kirk Cousins in the last 2 weeks hasn't been great, has only thrown 1 touchdown in each of those contests, but nonetheless, Justin Jefferson is getting his opportunity and he's delivering on it. Other wide receiver ones against this defense as of late: Corey Davis, 5 catches, 97, 2 touchdowns. Brandin Cooks, 9 catches, 112. We saw DeVonta Smith last week, of course, get himself 7 catches for 77 yards. We've seen a lot of wide receivers play well against the Carolina Panthers. And in my opinion, there's just another opportunity for Justin Jefferson to, of course, meet his potential of that 70-yard plus, but, of course, accompany it with a touchdown and get himself in the top 6 conversation here. Moving on to Terry McLaurin at number 7. Terry McLaurin, despite the fact that he didn't play particularly well, 11 targets for 4 receptions, that's unfortunate, right? A lot of it has to do with the quality of targets. All of it, a lot of it also has to do with the fact that, the quarterback play wasn't the best this last weekend against the New Orleans Saints. The New Orleans Saints defense played a lot better than they had in weeks past. Of course, they're kind of an on and off team. They sometimes they flip the switch, sometimes they just don't even show up. But with that said, Terry McLaurin getting that kind of opportunity week in and week out is all we can ask for, because eventually with that kind of opportunity or exposure to opportunity, it's going to lead to success. 4 catches for 46 is not going to be a commonality for Terry McLaurin-esque wide receiver. I think he's in a very good spot this upcoming week, playing against the Kansas City Chiefs that have given up the 11th most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season. Of course, we've seen guys like Emmanuel Sanders, 3 catches, 54, and 2 touchdowns this last week. DeVonta Smith, 7 catches for 122. And on top of it, against that Kansas City game, there were a lot of touchdowns called back for wide receivers that could have even added to the Kansas City total and made them one of the worst teams against the wide receiver position. We saw Mike Williams earlier this year, 7 catches, 122 and 2 touchdowns. Hollywood Brown in week 2, 6 catches, 113 and a touchdown. Ultimately, I think Terry McLaurin's in a great spot with Curtis Samuel once again injuring himself without Logan Thomas in that lineup. And of course, not really many other receivers besides Adam Humphries out there vying for targets. Terry McLaurin's definitely going to be given the opportunity and deliver on it. DJ Moore is our number 8. Now, the only reason I've moved DJ Moore as low as I have in comparison to what we had last week is my concern for what this offense is becoming. You're probably going to get Christian McCaffrey back. That's going to, pretty much siphon a couple targets here and there. But ultimately for DJ Moore, the number 1 wide receiver of this offense, it shouldn't really hurt him in the bottom line. My concern for DJ Moore this week isn't the matchup. They play against Minnesota, and though that may be the case, we've seen other wide receiver ones produce well against them. I mean, DK Metcalf, 6 catches, 107 and a touchdown. Going back to week 1, of course, we saw Jamar Chase go for over 100 and a touchdown against them. The Arizona Cardinals torched this defense. They scored 3 receiving touchdowns from the wide receiver position. So again, I'm not worried about the matchup in any sort of capacity. What concerns me is Sam Darnold. Sam Darnold has thrown 5 interceptions in the last 2 games. If that is something that is going to persist, then the team itself is going to be struggling. And of course, the opportunities for DJ Moore are going to diminish. And if that's going to be the case, his overall upside is going to diminish. Again, with that even being said, as long as Sam Darnold is going to be up to the task of not throwing interceptions and giving his receivers a chance, I think DJ Moore is in a pretty good spot this week as our number 8. Mike Williams is our number 9. Now you may be wondering, how can the guy that is literally the number 1 overall wide receiver in fantasy be at number 9, Andrew? He's coming off a 32.5-point fantasy week and has been unbelievable and quite frankly unstoppable in the National Football League. And I understand that, but just hear it from my perspective. He has played against easy matchups every single week. We talk about, okay, what are the most advantageous matchups? I say it every week. And he's played against Washington. They're giving up the 4th most. Played against Dallas, Kansas City, Cleveland, and he's killed every single one of them. Played against Las Vegas, which is actually one of the tougher defenses, and he didn't do anything. Makes sense. And now you get to play against the Baltimore Ravens. Now, the Baltimore Ravens may not be the best defense in the world. Obviously, the Indianapolis Colts had a lot to say about that, and certainly did put up a good performance against them. But nonetheless, this is the biggest test for Mike Williams this season. Playing against Marlon Humphreys this week is going to determine whether or not he is a legit wide receiver 1 in the National Football League. And though he's been getting double-digit targets, 16 targets this last week is incredible. But let's take into account, Mike Williams had 2 receptions of 40-plus yards and a touchdown. Yes, beating somebody over the top takes skill. Or, having to branch out wide open for a 40-yard receiving touchdown. Great. Maybe that's a fault of the Cleveland Browns secondary. But I'm not going to blame Mike Williams for that. I'm just saying he's an automatic start, but it's the biggest test that he's had all season in terms of corner coverage. We'll see how he stacks up against Marlon Humphreys, one of the better coverage corners in the NFL. We move on to Jamar Chase, our number 10. Jamar Chase, every single week we hear it, and it is what it is. Jamar Chase continues to put up stats that are comparing him to Randy Moss. And, we love to see it because Justin Jefferson had an incredible rookie season last year. And we saw another one of these LSU wide receivers come out and produce incredible numbers. Every single week, he's just, defying the odds. And the amount of points he's putting up in fantasy requires him to be a start every single week. That's why he's in this conversation. And that's why he's been in our top 24 for the last couple weeks, because he has to be a start regardless of who he plays against. Last week had the privilege of not having to go up against Jair Alexander and killed that Green Bay Packers secondary, which of course we all anticipated him to kill. When you have Kevin King and rookie cornerbacks and trying to bring up guys off practice squads of Arizona, it's not going to help you out much. With that said, he plays against the Detroit Lions. We talk about it every week. Detroit's defense is nothing. It's literally just a bunch of NPCs running around, and I really do feel like wide receivers dominate against. A couple of these performances really do prove that. We go back to week 1, Deebo Samuel, 9 catches, 189 and a touchdown. The week after, Adams, 8 catches for 121. Darnell Mooney, of all wide receivers, 5 catches for 125, with Justin Fields at quarterback, might I add. And Justin Jefferson this last week, 7 catches, 124. We've seen multiple wide receivers go for over 120 receiving yards against them. Jamar Chase, this is another week to do so. DK Metcalf's our number 11. You may be wondering, why do I have DK Metcalf here? Andrew, don't you remember Russell Wilson is out for the next 6 to 8 weeks with that finger injury on his throwing hand? I remember. But let's not forget, Geno Smith is still a quarterback of the National Football League. And quite frankly, when he came in, he targeted DK Metcalf early and often. 4 targets in that span of time in which he was in the game. Got DK Metcalf a receiving touchdown. And I think when you play against the Pittsburgh Steelers, regardless of who's at the quarterback position, there's always going to be a possibility that a guy like DK Metcalf, his skill is going to surpass anything that is going on at the quarterback position. And as long as you get this man the ball in stride, he's going to be able to make plays. There's a reason why he's coming off a week in which he had 98 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns against the Los Angeles Rams. That is no joke of a secondary, and they're even shadowing him with Ramsey. And I know I talked about last week, Ramsey plays predominantly in the slot position. And that's a fact. You can go check the stats. He plays majority, more than 50% of his snaps every single week in the slot position. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to move him around. And even when they moved him out wide, what did DK Metcalf do? Run a skinny post, boom, touchdown. DK Metcalf's skill is something that we can't deny. And when you play against the third easiest matchup of the wide receiver position, when a guy like Sutton is coming off a week with Teddy Bridgewater at quarterback, 7 catches, 120 and a touchdown after spraining his ankle at practice on Friday. Oh my goodness. I mean, Jamar Chase, 4 catches, 65 and 2 touchdowns. Ruggs, of all the wide receivers in the world, Ruggs went for 113 and a touchdown. DK Metcalf's my 11, and I'm not even worried about it. Mike Evans is our number 12, closing out the wide receiver 1 conversation. We love Mike Evans here. I mean, look, the whole thing about Mike Evans in comparison to every other Tampa Bay wide receiver is, yes, who's it going to be this week? Who's going to be scoring, and who is going to be the most steady overall impact in terms of the receiving core there? And though they all have upside, and though they all have the potential of being the number 1 in a given week, I think Mike Evans in the last 4 weeks has proven that, yes, he's once again the number 1. He's led the team in total targets at the wide receiver position. And in the last 4 weeks, he's at least had either 75 receiving yards or a receiving touchdown in his performances. So, in my opinion, when we get to the conversation of what he could potentially do on Thursday night against the Philadelphia Eagles, I mean, yes, the Philadelphia Eagles have been one of the better secondaries in the National Football League. But when you have Tom Brady coming to town, coming off a week in which he had 400 passing yards, 5 passing touchdowns on a short week without Gronk, of course, that will increase the overall potential of Mike Evans scoring touchdowns again. Already twice this season, he has had 2 receiving touchdown games. I mean, could we ask for more? Probably not. I think Mike Evans is in line for a great, overall productive week this upcoming Thursday night, specifically tomorrow. And I think Mike Evans definitely going to be able to ball out. We move on to the wide receiver 2 conversation, beginning with Diontae Johnson. Now, you may be wondering, Andrew, where did Diontae Johnson go after that first quarter? Because, I sat there on the couch. We turned on Red Zone, and boom, Diontae Johnson scores a touchdown early on Sunday. What happened to Diontae Johnson? He went with 2 catches, 2 targets, 72 receiving yards, and a touchdown, and then pretty much disappeared. And I hear you, but here's the thing. It doesn't really bother me. He got his production, and going forward, without Juju Smith-Schuster in this lineup, I think there's a very good chance in which Diontae Johnson gets even more targets going forward. Of course, it's going to help Claypool. And of course, running the ball as much as they did and how effective they were running the ball with Najee Harris makes an entire, game plan shift from, of course, throwing it heavily to running the ball. And with that all taken into account, something that they haven't done in the last, year and a half now, because really they haven't run the ball effectively in a while, I think Diontae Johnson is primed for another great performance here. And that's why he's at 13. The 8th easiest, overall matchup this week against Seattle secondary. We saw Woods last week, 12 catches, 150. Deebo Samuel, 8 catches, 156 and 2 touchdowns. We had Justin Jefferson, 9 catches, 118 and a touchdown. Julio Jones had 6 catches, 128. Had a receiving touchdown, but, they didn't want to do the replay system well. They didn't have the angle for it. Regardless, Diontae Johnson's a stud. He's the number 1 of this team, and going forward, should see more opportunity. Chris Godwin's on number 14. I like Chris Godwin at number 14. I don't know what it is. He's just a perfect fit for 14 because he always has the potential of upside, but as of late, hasn't been the greatest. 11 targets is good. 7 receptions, great. 70 yards. Okay, we'll take it. 10.5 fantasy points. But ultimately, unless he's scoring touchdowns, he really can't get into that top 12 conversation. And I think, yes, the Philadelphia Eagles matchup is probably one that they could very easily go for 300 passing yards for Tom Brady and 3 passing touchdowns, and he could literally feed every single one of his, top 3 wide receivers, and they could all have great weeks. There's a very good possibility of that, and that's why we have them in this conversation, because you never know who it's going to be in that given week. Regardless, I think Chris Godwin in the matchup has himself a very good chance of an upside performance. We leave him at 14 once again. I think this is the second or third week in a row we have him here. But either way, he's a guy you're starting every single week regardless. We have Keenan Allen as our number 15. Speaking of Keenan Allen, he's kind of like Chris Godwin in the fact that they both play in the slot position. They're both given a lot of opportunity, but without a touchdown, Keenan Allen's coming off a week in which he had 10.5 fantasy points, similar to a Chris Godwin. Now the question is, what could we potentially see against the Baltimore Ravens this week? If in fact we have a situation in which, of course, Mike Williams and Marlon Humphreys are battling, and there's not really much, leeway there at the wide receiver position to get Mike Williams more work, Keenan Allen is going to be asked to step up. And I think, based on what we've seen from the wide receiver position against the Baltimore Ravens, we've seen far lesser wide receivers find production against them at the slot position. Paris Campbell, 4 catches, 56 out of nowhere. Khalif Raymond, 6 catches, 68. Hunter Renfrow, 6 catches, 70. Wide receivers in the slot position can very easily score against the Baltimore Ravens. It's just a matter of how much opportunity you're going to get. And I think Keenan Allen is among that, that wide receiver group in which he's averaging about, 10 plus targets per week. And as long as that number is there, he'll always have potential upside. Just this last week, of course, 3 touchdowns went to Eckler, 2 went to Mike Williams. That's not going to be the case every single week. Eventually, Keenan Allen will score, and he will prove to be, that lower end wide receiver 1 category. But for now, we leave him at 15. Robert Woods is our number 16 overall wide receiver. I mean, Robert Woods, what more could we say? 14 targets, 12 receptions, 150 yards on Thursday night against the Seattle Seahawks secondary that really could not stop them. Ultimately, it was even a slow first half for Matthew Stafford in terms of scoring touchdowns. If you got an offense there where, they're completely clicking, there's no mistakes, there's no turnovers. If you accompany that performance with a touchdown, Robert Woods is on the moon. Now, going into this upcoming week's matchup, he does have a tougher cornerback matchup with James Bradbury, but like we've seen in the last couple weeks, James Bradbury has had his handful with number 1 wide receivers, whether it was Terry McLaurin that put up a huge game on him. What was it? 11 catches, 107 yards, and a touchdown. We also saw CeeDee Lamb this last week, and Amari Cooper both score touchdowns. There's a lot of upside for, of course, this entire offense from the Los Angeles Rams to succeed, especially when the other side of the ball, the New York Giants, their offense is all injured. And if they're not going to be able to keep the ball and they're going to be punting consistently, it will lead to more opportunity for the Los Angeles Rams receivers and Robert Woods in specific. Chase Claypool is our number 17. We're talking about another Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver. And we haven't really talked about multiple Pittsburgh Steelers wide receivers in this kind of a capacity in quite some time. In reality, with Juju Smith-Schuster going down with an injury, with the tight end position, whether it is Ebron or Freiermuth being pretty much non-factors in this offense, and Ben Roethlisberger looking like a better quarterback against a Denver secondary. I mean, they've got one of the better ones. They even activated Ronald Darby this last week, and it didn't matter. Big Ben delivered, and Claypool was there to, of course, help him with 5 catches, 130 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. We had ourselves a great game, and perhaps the resurgence of Claypool to get him back into the conversation of being a weekly start, someone we don't have to worry about because the targets are going to be there. In the weeks in which Diontae Johnson was injured last year and missing, and they didn't have that other, potential upside of a receiver, he played well. Even this season, when Diontae Johnson didn't play, we ended up getting a game out of Claypool, 9 catches, over 90 receiving yards. If that kind of production is going to consistently be there, the targets are going to be there. I think there's a lot of potential in which, against the Seattle Seahawks, that of course we talked about earlier with Diontae, 120 yards to Julio, 118 in the touchdown to Justin Jefferson, 156 in 2 touchdowns to Debo, and 150 in 12 catches from Woods. Chase Claypool's in a great spot. CeeDee Lamb is our number 18. Though I think the Dallas Cowboys could spread the ball out more, let's just put it into perspective. In the last 3 weeks, the leading total target getter in this offense is Dalton Schultz. CeeDee Lamb and Amari Cooper combined have as many targets as Dalton Schultz. So let's put that in perspective. CeeDee Lamb has been underutilized as of late. But this upcoming week gets to play against a Bill Belichick-led defense, A defense that likes to shut down tight ends, likes to shut down wide receivers, and likes to force quarterbacks to make plays with lesser guys. But to be honest, when I look at CeeDee Lamb and the opportunity that he's going to have this upcoming week, it just makes me think you probably have to start him regardless of the matchup. I mean, he's one of these wide receivers that on any given week could certainly go for 18 plus fantasy points, maybe even more, on a handful of potential receptions. He hasn't been given much opportunity this year, especially in comparison to week 1. And they've been running the ball extremely effectively. 30 attempts per game is no joke. They're getting into the conversation of that, running the ball as well as Tennessee or Cleveland or Minnesota. So at this current moment in time, I look at this offense, I think to myself, yes, CeeDee Lamb has potential, but because of the matchup, because of the lack of opportunity, I can't put him any higher than a number 18 spot. Despite how talented he is, I still think there's a lot of potential here for production, and that's why we have him there. Move on to number 19, we have Courtland Sutton. Courtland Sutton this season has had 2 performances that really have carried his whole year. I mean, really have just been unbelievable. In the games in which he's had 10 or more targets this season, I mean, he's a completely different wide receiver as he's either gone for 100 receiving yards or like this last week, 100 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown against Pittsburgh. This upcoming week, they take on the Las Vegas Raiders secondary. And like we mentioned already, the Las Vegas Raiders secondary, they don't give up a lot of points to opposing wide receivers. But that doesn't really mean much. When we talk about Teddy Bridgewater, when we talk about the fact that he likes to throw the ball deep, of course, Courtland Sutton leads all wide receivers in terms of air yards in the National Football League, meaning the ball is being traveled down the field. They're just not completing the passes. If we can get there and we can click like we did last week or 2 weeks prior, I think there's a very good chance we get another big performance out of a Courtland Sutton. I was worried this last week, of course, with the news that he had messed up his ankle at practice on Friday, that he potentially wasn't even going to be a full go against that Pittsburgh Steelers secondary, but nonetheless showed up and balled out. That gives me more confidence for the future, but either way, Courtland Sutton's on number 19. Marquise Hollywood Brown, another one of these guys that you may be wondering, why is Marquise Hollywood Brown the number 6 overall wide receiver in fantasy, Andrew? A guy that's coming off a 29-point game and a buzzer beater touchdown in overtime against the Indianapolis Colts. A guy that is really just dominating at the wide receiver position. Why is he at your number 20? Well, let me explain this. The Los Angeles Chargers are no joke. Their secondary is actually one of the better ones in the National Football League. I'll go ahead and I'll pull up the stats just to reiterate it. In terms of points or statistics given up to opposing wide receivers, like the best overall games that we've seen from wide receivers this season. CeeDee Lamb, 8 catches, 81 yards. Outside of that, if you want to talk about receivers scoring touchdowns, McCole Hardman had one. It was on that little shovel pass forward as they motion across the screen. It's like a jet sweep, but just a forward pass. It could be considered a rushing touchdown for all I care about. But McCole Hardman, touchdown. Hunter Renfrow scored a touchdown against them. And then Rashard Higgins. I mentioned it when I talked about matchups. The best receivers against this team often aren't the number ones. It'll probably be a Rashad Bateman week for all we know, or a Sammy Watkins week. But I think regardless of all of that, the fact of the matter is this is the biggest challenge for Marquise Brown. And if he's going to have weeks in which he's catching 9 out of 10 targets for 125 yards, 2 touchdowns, and on top of that, in the first half, I mean, he could have had 4 touchdowns in this game. You go back, you watch the film, wide open on a play, Lamar Jackson doesn't look in his direction. He's literally standing in the end zone wide open. Another play, throws the end zone target, too low, hits the floor. In my opinion, Marquise Brown is in a good spot. The biggest challenge, though, is this secondary and how they're going to try to bottle him up and double team him the entire game. We'll see if they're able to do that, but regardless, a must play. We're moving on to Antonio Brown, our number 21. I think Antonio Brown's another one of these wide receivers, like we talked about, Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, that has a chance that every single week could be the number 1 on their respective team. And just last week, 7 catches, 124, and 2 touchdowns. I even talked about it last week. The last time he played against the Miami Dolphins was with Tom Brady when they were both Patriots, and he scored in that contest. They come back out, and they put up an incredible game. Antonio Brown's only playing 60% of the offensive snaps. Just kind of let that sink in. He's not even playing that much. But when he's on the field, he gets targets for the amount of routes that he runs. And that in itself means that he has Tom Brady's eye. And as long as he's going to have the eye of Tom Brady, whether it is Hollywood Brown or Antonio Brown, both cousins, they both balled out last week. And I think they'll once again have themselves great weeks here in week 6. Playing against the Philadelphia Eagles on Thursday night. When everybody's worried about Godwin, Fournette in the backfield, Evans, they often forget that AB is AB, and he's looked better than he has in quite some time. We move on to Brandin Cooks, our number 22. A lot of you guys in the comment section were letting me know, Andrew, you were missing AB last week. Why is that the case? How could you let somebody that's one of the better wide receivers in the National Football League kind of not be in this top conversation? Well, he played against the Buffalo Bills in week 4, and he didn't have a great game. And I thought to myself, well, if he's playing against New England the next week, we know what Bill Belichick likes to do, especially against his former players. He likes to respect them and humble them by shutting them down. And that's what he did. He shut down Brandin Cooks, and that was anticipated. Now, prior to all of that, prior to the last 2 matchups, which were extremely difficult, he's coming off of week 1, 2, and 3, in which he had 132 yards, 78 yards and a touchdown, and 112 receiving yards. Whether it was with Tyrod Taylor or Davis Mills, doesn't matter. Brandin Cooks is a good wide receiver. We know this. And he plays against one of the easiest matchups of the wide receiver position. In fact, against a team that has given up 10 touchdowns to opposing wide receivers this season. I mean, just looking at what Tyler Lockett and, of course, DK Metcalf have done against this defense, they both combined for 8 receptions, 160 yards, and 3 touchdowns against them in the week in which they played. Cooper Kupp, 9 catches, 163, and 2 touchdowns against Indianapolis. Devontae Parker scored a touchdown with 77 yards, and Hollywood Brown this last week, like we just talked about minutes ago, 125 and 2 touchdowns. Could have had more. Brandin Cooks is a fantastic play, regardless of who's at quarterback, because this offense, though, we saw, Chris Conley and, Moore score huge points. It was a matter of, just locking down Cooks. And I don't think we're going to see that this week out of Indianapolis. We move on to A.J. Brown, number 23. I know you may be frustrated. I know you may be concerned. But, hey, if you have A.J. Brown and you're not going to use him, you might as well just trade him. I think this is a guy that has to be started every single week, regardless of matchup. And though many people may be worried about Tre'Davious White, I am not. I think Tre'Davious White is a good cornerback, and we have to respect his skill, but I think A.J. Brown is just as good, if not better, of a wide receiver in a respective matchup. Last season, they played against the Buffalo Bills. In fact, it was a Tuesday game. If you guys remember that, A.J. Brown had himself a great performance. I mean, on 9 total targets, 7 receptions, 82 yards, and a touchdown. And though this is a completely different defense, the secondary is all the same. It's just a matter of whether or not Ryan Tannehill can deliver. And while the defense stacks the box in order to stop Derrick Henry, it will open up opportunities for A.J. Brown against his secondary. And I know Patrick Mahomes didn't look good, and the receiving corps didn't look great against them. I think this is a week that a lot of people may be fading A.J. Brown, while I'll be, of course, buying in on him and riding him this week to victory. We move on to Michael Pittman Jr., our number 24. Michael Pittman has been unbelievable. In the last 4 weeks, he's garnered 39 total targets. In fact, in the last 4 weeks, he's been the number 15 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format. Coming off a week in which he had 89 yards on 6 catches, 1 receiving touchdown for 17.9 fantasy points in that shootout on Monday night. I look and I see a Houston matchup, one that in my opinion is very favorable for the wide receiver position, though a lot of receivers haven't produced well against them. It mainly has to do with the fact that, people just run the ball in Houston and they succeed every single week. So now that I kind of look at this matchup, I know that there's, the rumors, potentially, T.Y. Hilton is back. I know he practiced today, that's for sure, but it doesn't mean he's immediately playing this week. I think Michael Pittman's going to continue to be that number 1 in this offense, and he potentially should find a lot of value and upside this week. Moving on to the wide receiver 3 conversation, we're going to begin with DeVonta Smith. DeVonta Smith has slowly but surely found himself a lot of productivity in the last couple weeks. And of course, with a quarterback like Jalen Hurts, as successful as he has been, regardless of whether it is during the beginning of the game, middle of the game, or in garbage time, they're finding value. In the last 2 weeks consecutively, we've seen great amount of receptions, 7 in each of them, 18 total targets, in one game, 77 receiving yards, which again was this last week against Carolina, or the week prior against Kansas City, 122 receiving yards. I think the Tampa Bay matchup, giving up the second most points to the opposing wide receiver position, has a lot to do with the fact that in week 1, they got destroyed by Dallas. Cooper and Lamb went for, 20 catches, 243 and 3 touchdowns. I get it. And other wide receivers have succeeded. I mean, the week after, Ridley, 7 catches, 63 and a touchdown. Cooper Kupp, 9 catches, 96 and 2 touchdowns. But, we have to kind of just put it in perspective. This defense, they don't have the best secondary. Teams do not want to run against them. And it's just going to force people to throw the ball. And I love the fact that DeVonta Smith is getting more and more targets every week. And as long as it's trending in the direction where DeVonta Smith is getting a lot of targets in the second half of this contest because they're trying to fight from behind, I think it just leads to more and more fantasy points and more success. Amari Cooper's our number 26. I think Amari Cooper's in an okay spot. I talked about it in relation with CeeDee Lamb earlier in this episode. They are not getting a lot of targets. CeeDee Lamb and Amari Cooper in the last 3 weeks have each gotten 12 targets, while a guy like Dalton Schultz has gotten 24 total targets and led the team. That is alarming and very concerning, but he's coming off a second consecutive week of a receiving touchdown. We'll take that. And as long as he's going to be given that kind of opportunity, there's always a potential of him being in this, wide receiver 2, wide receiver 1 conversation. But the targets are not there, and they're not convincing enough for me to have him at that position right now. And when you play against Bill Belichick, a tougher matchup, as well as they have played this season, I think Amari Cooper at 26, a solid wide receiver 3 option, probably in many cases your wide receiver 2 or your flex this week. You're riding him out there because the potential's there in the offense. It's definitely going to be throwing the ball a lot this week. We move on to Adam Thielen, our number 27. We talked about this in relation to Adam Thielen last week. He is touchdown dependent. In the first 3 weeks of the season, when he scores 4 touchdowns, we're thinking, oh my God, Adam Thielen's not stopping. And then in the last 2 weeks, nosedives into having a 5-point performance, 2 catches, 40 yards. And though his catches were some of the clutchest in the game, when they needed a score, when they needed to go down the field and kick a field goal to win the game, to force Dan Campbell to cry in that post-game conference, Adam Thielen was the target, and he got it. Nonetheless, I think the Carolina Panthers secondary, they've given up points to wide receivers, especially number ones. And Adam Thielen's not the number one of this team. And Kirk Cousins has struggled and gone from, week 2 and 3 throwing 3+ touchdowns in each of those games to going and throwing for 1 touchdown in each of the last 2 games. It is worrisome, but I think there's a potential in which Adam Thielen could get back on track this week. It should be more of a competitive matchup between these 2 teams. And hopefully, we're going to get more opportunity for him. We're going to get out of this 5-target range, get back into the 9-10 region. Moving on to our number 28, we have Tyler Lockett. Tyler Lockett is a very tricky overall play, in my opinion. He may be a guy that we want to just wait and see, but you may not have a chance to do that because, again, we have 4 teams on bye. And if that's going to be the case, well, I'm confident enough to say I'm willing to ride him out there and see what I can get out of him, especially against Pittsburgh, giving up a lot of points. Last week when Geno Smith came in, he targeted Tyler Lockett 4 times. Okay, that's not bad. Just as many targets as DK Metcalf got. So as long as the opportunity is there and they're throwing the ball, which they probably will be for majority of the game because you don't really want to run the ball against Pittsburgh, he's going to have opportunity. Whether, he's going to have upside, that's the biggest question because he's already a volatile receiving option, a guy that needs that 60+ receiving yard touchdown to be, in that conversation of the wide receiver 2, wide receiver 1 category. I think we're going to leave that at the door this week, and we're going to hope that he could just get himself like 7 catches for 75 yards because that's the numbers that we're kind of trying to work with. We need 10+ fantasy points, and hopefully we can get that out of a receiver like Tyler Lockett, regardless of who's at quarterback. We're going to put that to the test this week. Emmanuel Sanders is our number 29. Now, here's the thing about Emmanuel Sanders. He's scoring touchdowns, and, Gabriel Davis, who? Cole Beasley, who? That's really what we've gotten to. Even, Stefon Diggs is playing second fiddle at times to him. With that said, 5 targets, 3 receptions, 2 receiving touchdowns this last week against Kansas City. It's a bit much, and though we don't anticipate that every single week, at least he's getting enough targets and getting enough receptions at that to even have balanced weeks regardless of whether he scores. But this week, he has Tennessee, the easiest matchup at the wide receiver position, a team that thus far this season has given up 8 receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers. That's actually the 3rd most in the National Football League right now. So when I look at this matchup and I think about what is Emmanuel Sanders potentially capable of doing, well, he's got to be able to compete with guys like Zach Moss, Josh Allen running the ball in, and of course, Dawson Knox. Outside of that, nobody else is scoring touchdowns in this offense. That makes me feel pretty confident about it. And I think this might be a one-sided affair early on, and the Buffalo Bills may be scoring often, and that'll definitely lead to a lot of points going in the direction of Emmanuel Sanders. T. Higgins is our number 30. Last week when we talked about T. Higgins, he had a lot of potential playing against Green Bay, but it was his first week back, but now gets to play against the Detroit Lions. The Detroit Lions secondary is one of the worst in the National Football League. And though T. Higgins is coming off a week in which he had 7 targets, 5 catches, 32 yards, I'm not too concerned about it because on the opposite side of the field, we have Jamar Chase. And Jamar Chase should be pulling double coverage from here on out. I don't think the defensive coordinator should ever let him play one-on-one man. Never. In very little scenarios should that ever proceed. But with that said, if in fact we get a scenario in which Jamar Chase is double covered, well, Detroit has been really bad against wide receivers. I mean, just the receivers, Justin Jefferson, Darnell Mooney, Deebo Samuel, and Davante Adams. Every single one of those receivers this season has gone for over 120 receiving yards against them. The yardage could potentially be there, and of course the touchdowns will be there. Joe Burrow's been playing well, and as long as this offense is primed and ready to go, I think T. Higgins will be a part of the entire advantage that the Bengals have up against the Detroit Lions defense. We have Jakobi Meyers at 31, another wide receiver that a lot of people talked about and were saying, Andrew, why didn't you have him in your rankings last week throughout the week? I had him in my rankings by the end of the week, mainly because we have to respect the amount of targets he got. But unfortunately, this last week was underwhelming. 4 catches for 56 yards on 5 targets, despite having, 26 total targets, the 2 weeks prior combined. This upcoming week takes on Dallas. We've talked about it a bunch. They give up a bunch of points to wide receivers. In fact, the 6th most this season. Yes, a lot of people want to talk about Diggs being one of the best corners in the league. He gets interceptions, sure, but he gives up yards. And it doesn't matter whether it's Diggs or Brown on the other side. These cornerbacks give up yards every single week and in bunches. They are a bend but don't break defense. They'll give up the yards, but they're not going to give up so many touchdowns unless we're talking about early on in the season where Mike Williams and, of course, that Tampa Bay trio killed them. There's always a possibility that Jakobi Meyers scores, but let's not forget he's never scored in his career. So for now, we'll say the yardage and the receptions will suffice, but of course, we're hoping for upside. Kadarius Toney is our number 32. Listen, if Golladay is doubtful and probably not going to play, we're going to have Shepard out, we're going to have Slayton out probably, Daniel Jones might miss, we're definitely going to have Saquon out. That means the entire skill position of this offense is gone. We're going to have Mike Glennon, Devontae Booker, and Kadarius Toney as the number 1, 2, and 3 of this team. When you think about the talent there, it's not the greatest, but when you think about what Kadarius Toney could potentially produce this week, we think, all right, if the Los Angeles Rams are not messing around and there is no Shepard, Slayton, and Golladay, they should probably put Jalen Ramsey on Kadarius Toney. They should really test this young kid. And if in fact they do that, can Kadarius Toney prove everyone wrong? I mean, he's coming off a week in which he had 13 targets, 10 receptions, 189 yards. I still think that he's a play regardless of the defense, because there's always potential. Because if there's no one else to throw the ball to, Mike Glennon is just going to funnel target him. And if it's, 10 catches for 50 yards, we're still going to take it. Either way, we're firing him up this week. Tim Patrick's our number 33. I talk about it. I mean, listen, maybe I got to put more respect on it just so we are all aware. He's put up 10-plus fantasy points in 4 out of the last 5 weeks. He gets to play against the Las Vegas Raiders this week, and though it's not the greatest matchup, they're probably going to throw the ball a good amount of times. And if Tim Patrick's going to continue to be the guy where he's getting his yardage and his receptions or scores his eventual touchdown like he has this season, again, another guy that we probably want to keep out there as a wide receiver 3 flex option. Moving on to our number 34, we have Marvin Jones Jr. In comparison to Shenault, he has the greater upside. We know that, especially in a half PPR. This upcoming week takes on the Miami Dolphins. And though he's coming off a game in which he only had 1 catch for 25 yards, and even that Thursday night game against the Bengals had very little utilization despite the absence of Chark, I think Marvin Jones has himself a decent week here against the Miami Dolphins secondary, giving up the 5th most points to wide receivers. And in fact, he gave up 2 receiving touchdowns to both Mike Evans and Antonio Brown. There's a very good chance that this secondary, though they have Xavier Howard and Byron Jones, they just can't produce. And they can't stop wide receivers. It's a defense that as a whole looks like a shell of themselves in comparison to years past. And in my opinion, Marvin Jones is a guy that you leave him on the bench, he goes for, probably 25 points this week. So I'm fired him up. Odell Beckham Jr. is our number 35. Eventually he's going to get it. Eventually it'll click. I mean, Baker looked great last week. Obviously, the receiving touchdowns went to, of course, David Njoku and Rashard Higgins, but eventually OBJ will get it. The 12th easiest matchup at the wide receiver position. And am I holding my breath for OBJ? No. But do I think it'll eventually click, potentially even this week? Yeah, I do. Because when you least expect it, OBJ, he'll show up and produce. Allen Robinson's the last wide receiver I wanted to mention because he plays against Green Bay. And he has a storied history against them and does have pretty decent performances, in fact. Good fantasy point productivity, but that's of the past. That's with a different quarterback. What matters is what we're going to see this week. With that Jair Alexander that we just saw Jamar Chase tear apart that secondary, there is so much opportunity to be had. You just got to feed him the ball. And we're going to hope that's going to be the case. But again, if you're worried about it and you're risk averse, there are a lot of other options to pivot to. Just wanted to mention him here. Again, just throwing my hat out there because maybe if in fact Allen Robinson has the breakout week. It's one that you may want to have on your roster. Otherwise, again, 5 points. It's the risk you have to be willing to take. You either go for the 15 or you go for the 5. Some of you want to just sit in the middle with 10. That's why Tim Patrick's on the screen. Either way, thank you everybody for watching. These are my rankings for week 6 of the wide receiver position. Hopefully, you understand my perspective and, of course, the breakdown that I've done for every single one of these receivers, kind of giving them all their due diligence, because I want to go ahead and give you guys the overall perspective and opinions rather than just say, hey, this guy's here, moving on. Thank you guys. Subscribe to the channel, like today's video, and until tomorrow, we'll talk about quarterbacks and tight ends in the same video. I'll see you guys. Peace.